for joining us this hour. Happy Monday. All right, here is Guam. Guam is an island. As you can tell, zoom out, you can see that it is way, way out there in the Pacific Ocean. If you think about flying from California to Hawaii, if you do that, that gets you roughly half the way there. Just keep going that distance again and you'll get to Guam. Guam is closer to the Philippines and China than it is to Hawaii. It is north of Australia. It's north of Papua New Guinea. It is basically so far west, it is east. Technically, Guam is an organized, unincorporated territory of the United States. The island sends a non-voting delegate to Congress. And Guamanians get to vote in a non-binding preference poll when it comes time to vote for president. Even if Guam doesn't have a vote in the actual electoral college, though, what Guam does have is a huge U.S. military presence. American military bases cover something like a third of the entire island. And those bases on Guam are a big part of the U.S. military presence in that whole part of the world, that whole region of the Pacific. A couple of years ago, the Pentagon considered building an even bigger military presence on the island of Guam. The plan would have increased the population of Guam by almost half. And when that plan was being considered in Congress, that's when a little-known congressman from Georgia named Hank Johnson spoke up in a hearing with this rather amazing comment on the giant U.S. military and its huge and maybe increasing presence on the tiny little island of Guam.
I don't know how many square miles that is. Do you happen to know?
I don't have that figure with me, sir. I can certainly supply it to you if you'd like.
Yeah, my fear is that the whole island will become so overly populated that it will tip over and capsize.
We don't anticipate that.
I love the Navy Admiral being there. I have to address the congressman's concern. We don't anticipate that, sir. The local Atlanta paper felt compelled to point out that Mr. Johnson, as far as they could tell, was not making an April Fool's joke when he talked about the island of Guam capsizing from the weight of all the new people there. But he kind of was making a joke there. He did not really think that Guam was going to tip over. He was using metaphor as a commentary on the size of the U.S. military presence on the island, and he was just being incredibly deadpan about it while he used that metaphor. Turns out that Congressman Deadpan Hank Johnson is a very funny congressman, but he's so deadpan about it, he so does not betray that he is making a joke, that other members of Congress do not laugh when he makes jokes. He's too funny for Congress. His deadpan humor does not play in the room. In the room with him do not get it. He's actually sending them up in a way that is just over their heads. Here's the latest from Congressman Hank Johnson. It's on the subject of helium.
Imagine, Mr. Speaker, a world without balloons. How can we make sure that the injustice of there being no helium for comedians to get that high-pitched voice that we all hold near and dear to our hearts? Imagine a world without balloons.
The guy behind him going, is anybody else listening to this? The high-pitched voice we all hold. Deadpan Hank Johnson. Again, they're making a point that surely went over a lot of people's heads. But it is a good point that he's making there. Really, it's our helium problem that's in need of a fix, Congress? Out of all the problems in this country, all the budget problems in our country, out of all the things that are underfunded in our country, the helium thing is the one that we need congressional action to zoom in on? Seriously? It's kind of a good argument, even if people didn't get the way he was making it. It's a good argument because the same zeal for budget cuts that threaten the beloved helium supply, the same zeal for budget cuts also means right now that elderly cancer patients in America are not getting their oncology drugs. Elderly people who depend on deliveries from Meals on Wheels for their daily nutrition are not getting those meals. This is an Indiana father reacting to the news in his town where they're having a lottery for preschool. They've put all the names trying to get into preschool into a fishbowl, and this man is listening to the results of that lottery in his town being called out, hoping to hear that his 4-year-old survived the cull because of budget cuts. The president State of the Union this year proposed upscaling our expectations for American education, specifically on the issue of preschool. The president said that universal preschool should now be the expectation and the reality in the United States. Preschool is so important for kids. Well, today, a report on that says essentially that we have unfathomably far to go before we can even start to think about universal preschool. Not only are we so far behind a goal like that, we were far behind that goal before we started this new policy we're living through right now of across-the-board cuts. Right now, we're really far behind, and we're getting worse. We're not getting better. Tens of thousands of kids across the country are getting kicked off preschool, including in places like Indiana, where the remaining few slots are being allocated by lottery, by heartbreaking lottery. The cuts that we are living through right now that are affecting everything from preschool slots to Meals on Wheels for elderly people to cancer drugs and when you can start taking your oncology treatment, they are all part of the same policy. They're all part of the same across-the-board cuts in what the government does. It always gets reported as across-the-board cuts in what the government spends, because that sounds nicer, right? Spending sounds like an awful thing. We ought to get rid of that. But government doing stuff? Well, it turns out some of the stuff that government does, we like. It's probably the reason that we do it. And some of the stuff that government does, which has now been cut, turns out is even the kind of stuff that Congress notices, the stuff that Congress likes, the stuff that Congress wants to protect because it's stuff that affects them. And so last week we saw Congress move with heretofore unseen lightning speed to protect one of the things that government does from these across-the-board cuts that were otherwise causing problems. Last week, with lightning speed, Congress moved to protect air traffic control because it was causing flight delays. And hey, flight delays, it turns out, those are really annoying. They're bad for the country. Those should be stopped. So Congress moved so fast to undo those cuts that they actually have to redo what they did tomorrow, because in their last week, they left a really important typo in the bill. That was how quickly they moved to stop these cuts that bothered them. These cuts that were affecting the one thing that government does that they were bothered by, making the planes run safely and on time. Coincidentally, they passed that legislation right before all going to the airport to get on planes themselves to go home at the end of Congress calling it a day. Cutting hundreds of billions of dollars all at once out of what government does hurts us as a country. What we have learned, though, thus far, by doing that, is that only some people get relief from those cuts. Only people with political capital get relief from those cuts. So, Indiana dad, sorry. But business traveler or congressman himself, annoyed by more time on the tarmac, yeah, Congress feels your pain. We'll get right on fixing that. The reason we are doing this, the reason we are inflicting all this harm on the country, all this harm specifically on people who do not have enough political capital to save themselves, is the doctrine of austerity. That is the overall idea right now, right? It's the overall fiscal conservative idea about what to do for a nation that has gone through the economic shock that we went through at the end of the Bush presidency. Austerity is the solution, according to the Beltway. They want the government to spend less, which sounds great if you see it only as government spending and not as stuff that the government does. Spending, that can't be good for anything. But stuff the government does, yeah, sometimes that's stuff we want. A week and a half ago, they tried to relaunch the Magna Carta of contemporary American austerity, the Simpson-Bowles plan, the conservative American austerity idea that has been around for a few years now, but they attempted to relaunch it on the morning that ended up being the day that Boston was locked down for 17 hours while the nation was transfixed by the manhunt for the second Boston bombing suspect. That was relaunch day for Simpson-Bowles this year. Bad timing, right? Both in terms of the optics of relaunching the text of government doesn't do anything right, let's cut government, in the midst of a massive and ultimately successful government to find that bombing suspect. So that's bad optics, right? I mean, that was the day that the streets of Watertown, Massachusetts ended up literally lined with Americans crying with joy and cheering their emergency services, clapping their government workers on the back for a job well done. The nation is grateful. That is a bad day to launch the let's fire all the government workers plan, right? It was bad timing for the Simpson-Bowles relaunch that day. Well, yesterday they relaunched it. In friendlier environs, they relaunched it on the op-ed page of the Washington Post. Meanwhile, the bigger picture